My last ride. We lived in the suburbs, but if you traveled 30 minutes or so, there were some beautiful country back roads with great scenery. The colors were spectacular, especially in autumn. September and October have always been my favorite months. My love of motorbikes goes back to my teenage years, especially back in the days when I was young and immortal. Now that I'm a little older and wiser, I know the risks outweigh the pleasure. As we age, I think it's normal to occasionally think about our own mortality. I don't know what awaits us after death, but I'm in no hurry to find out. A comedian said, "All men must die." I was just hoping for an exception. There are no exceptions. I am a creature of habit. My weekly routine in September and October was to rise around 7:30 a.m. on Sunday mornings. Weather permitting, I'd quietly dress in my motorcycle gear and leather jacket. Roll my bike down the driveway into the street before starting the engine. I didn't want to wake the family by revving the bike in the driveway. Tenny would ride for the pleasure of it. I'd take a 2 or 3 hour motorcycle trip while my wife and kids slept in. It was time for myself. I cruised the back roads and enjoyed the exhilaration of the speed and the wind. It was fun. I might think about work at the office, or I might think of nothing at all. Some days like that, I just enjoyed the experience. I timed my rides to get me back home no later than 11 a.m. That gave me time to make pancakes for Sunday breakfast. I'd wait until I was out of the subdivision to decide which route suited my taste for the day's ride. There were 3 routes in my playbook. They all took me through areas with minimal traffic and beautiful fall scenery. Unless I was stuck at a railroad crossing waiting for 100 boxcar loads of coal to pass, I was home by 10:30 to 11 o'clock at the latest. I am known for being punctual. This fall day I took a 2-lane blacktop road that wound through mostly cornfields and wooded areas. I just rode and enjoyed my morning. Some guys hunt and some guys fish. I rode my motorcycles. Everyone who works hard deserves a pastime. It was cheaper than golf. Daydreaming and cruising along, I suddenly found myself on a gravel road. I stopped immediately. I took off my helmet and looked around, hunting for landmarks to get my bearings. I was about a mile off blacktop. I'd traveled this route a dozen times or more. This time, for whatever reason, I had unintentionally turned off the blacktop about a mile back and was on gravel. That was a big deal. It's dangerous to ride on gravel. Plus, I treated my motorcycle like some guys treat their Corvette. I washed and waxed it regularly, and I never took my bike on gravel roads. It was also bad for my motorcycle. I wouldn't risk a paint chip from the rocks. A blemished paint job from a pebble would be a disaster. But here I was, on a dusty gravel farm road that went nowhere. I chided myself for not paying better attention. I couldn't even recall what kept my mind so preoccupied. I turned the bike around and headed the short mile back to asphalt. I picked up where I had left off and finished my motorcycle ride. I rolled up my driveway and headed inside to start breakfast. Instead of my usual greeting, I was met by a tearful wife. "Where the hell have you been?" "I've been worried sick." I called the police and asked if they had responded to any accidents. "I was just about to get in the car and hunt for you. I was afraid you ran off the road somewhere and might be hurt." "Where did you go?" she asked, tears rolling down her cheeks. "The usual," I said defensively. "What's wrong with you?" "It's 12:30. That's what's wrong with me." "Where have you been for 2 hours?" It was unbelievable. I was as clueless as she was. I was sometimes the absent-minded professor type, misplacing my car keys or my wallet. That was nothing new. I hadn't stopped that day, not even for gas. There were no coal trains crossing my path that day. The only exception to my normal ride was the 1-mile wrong turn down some farm road in the few minutes it took to get back onto blacktop. That couldn't account for more than 10 minutes. The clock on the wall, the sun in the sky, and the lack of cartoons blaring on the TV all confirmed that I was 2 hours late. I went out and looked my bike over. It was dustier than usual. That was expected from the short trip on gravel. Glancing at my wrist, my timepiece clearly read 12:50. I should have arrived home between 10:30 and 11 a.m. I was shocked. The odometer was no help. I didn't keep track of the miles since it was a familiar route. I never checked the time because the ride was my watch. To check my wristwatch would have involved taking one hand off handlebars and hunting for a watch under leather gloves and a long leather sleeve. All I could do was apologize profusely. Pancakes were off the menu today. My wife's initial fear for my safety now turned into justified anger. I was baffled too. I had no defense or explanation. I reviewed the course of the ride in my head. I kept coming back to the only variable: a short diversion down that gravel farm road. There was no reason why I shouldn't have arrived back home at 10:38 m. Now was not the time to approach my wife. We were both emotional. This would take some time for things to calm down. Later that afternoon we sat and talked. I'd sell my bike before I'd allow it to cause trouble in my marriage. She accepted my apology. I also told her I'd put the bike up for sale. It was time. Before we had finished, she said she'd had an odd experience herself on the night before. She said she'd save that for later, but in the meanwhile she had an idea she was eager to discuss. Could you have had an experience like Betty and Barney Hill? She asked. A few years earlier, she had read an account of a New Hampshire couple in a reputable news magazine. After our experiences from 1977, nothing seemed too far-fetched as to be outside the realm of possibility. I was surprised she even thought about it. We simply didn't discuss the topic, and here she was asking me to pursue it. Grasping for anything to help me make sense of what happened, I agreed. Sure, I can't rule it out. But secretly, I thought to myself, there's a reasonable explanation for this mess. I just had to review my ride step by step and an explanation would surface. One never did. I wanted to make peace with my wife. The Hills had a very similar experience, so I could examine their plight as a remote possibility. I asked her, by any chance did you happen to save that magazine? She did. Of course she did. I was skeptical about the article at first, but after the first couple pages, I was hooked. I eagerly read every word. It is an incredible story. Betty and Barney Hill were the couple whose case coined the phrase, missing time is used in UFO terminology. The Hills were also the first couple to go public with their story of an alien spacecraft and abduction experience. Their story made worldwide press. In case you're no familiar, here's a brief synopsis of their story. In September 1961, the Hills lost 3 hours of time on a road trippy car. Their usual 7-hour drive through a forested area of New Hampshire took 10 hours. They were traveling at night on a route they'd traveled many times before. They were never lost, they never made a wrong turn or broke down with car trouble. Neither of them had an explanation. Both were sick for a few days after they got home. Their mechanical watches had stopped working, and here was a strange powder-like stain on Betty's dress. Barney noticed the tops of his shoes were scuffed. The strap on his binoculars had broken, and here was damage to the trunk of their car, damage that wasn't there when Barney loaded their suitcases hours earlier. They were both sick when they arrived home. They sought medical help weeks later, when Betty's nightmares became unbearable. Eventually, they were referred to a psychiatrist named Dr. Stevens. Stevens was a medical doctor and a practicing psychiatrist who sometimes used hypnosis in treating patients. Dr. Stevens suggested a hypnosis session. He thought it might help the Hills to recall details about what happened that evening and account for the missing time. When they were referred to Dr. Stevens, neither one had a recollection of what had happened during the 3 hours that were just gone. Betty recalled seeing a strange star in the sky, but that was all. The Hills agreed to hypnosis, and what was revealed was incredible. I encourage you to read the transcripts. Their hypnosis sessions were all recorded, and a copy of the transcript is easily found online. If you're the least bit interested, I encourage you to read them. The transcripts describe a horrific experience at the hand of alien beings. They were abducted and taken aboard a spacecraft against their will. These were all memories of real events that had somehow been suppressed from their consciousness. It was hard to believe these two very credible people would corroborate to pull off such an outrageous hoax. They appeared to have lost much more than they gained from the experience. They said when they were aboard the spacecraft, they were examined and suffered painful medical procedures performed by non-human entities. Betty recalled that one of the beings held an instrument described as resembling a knitting needle. He wanted to stick it into Betty's navel. She cried and begged him not to do it. The fear in her voice is palpable. It must be heard to grasp the terror she experienced. Betty could recall one of the entities showing her a star chart and explaining it's where they came from. With pen and paper, she drew it from memory when she got home but didn't recognize its significance. She put it aside. Years later, a respected astronomer would match Betty's star map to the known universe, and against the odds, he found a perfect match. Sure, someone could argue with the number of stars in the sky. If you look hard enough, you should be able to match any configuration. What amazes me is that she was able to recall the image at all. Whenever Sheila and I discussed my 1977 encounter, the nightmares would return without fail. My poor wife was exhausted from years of being rudely awakened by her husband's screams at 3 a.m. She'd soaked in sweat and a pillowcase with a drop of blood now and then. She was tired of it. So instead, I turned my attention to the Hills encounter, objectively. I wouldn't seek parallels to what bits I could remember from my own experience. Instead, I read it for amusement and didn't dwell on it. After ruling out a stroke, epilepsy, and all the other possibilities I could think of short of temporary madness, an alien abduction seemed like a viable explanation. Despite the focus of this book and my past experiences, I'm not someone who jumps to a paranormal explanation for every inexplicable event. I try to approach problems the way I practice law, slowly and systematically, and examining all possibilities before reaching a conclusion. Occam's razor is a 14th century approach to problem solving. The phrase was coined by a gentleman named William of Ockham in the 14th century. In Latin it's lex parsimoniae, or the law of parsimony. I know. Too much information. In plain English, it's a problem-solving principle that works like these. First, identify every possible explanation and investigate each one carefully and thoroughly. Usually the simplest explanation will answer the question. Once you've ruled out the impossible, and you're left with just one explanation, that's your answer. No matter how extraordinary it might sound, that is your answer. I hated to face it, but it made sense. If any of this stuff makes sense, it could account for the 2 hours that are missing from my trip. I admitted alien abduction was a possibility I couldn't dismiss out of hand, but I wasn't willing to give it the analysis it deserved. I did want to suffer the repercussions that accompanied dwelling on the past. Thank you, Sheila. That's fascinating, I said. I handed her magazine back. We wordlessly agreed whatever the reason for the 2-hour gap. Wait, drop it there. Then I remembered. Sheila, you said you had an odd experience of your own to tell me about. She began with, now I know this is hard to believe. I was shaking my head. No. We live in a world full of oddities. She didn't need to preface her story or qualify her observations. In a calm and almost matter-of-fact tone of voice she said, Terry, Saturday night, I woke up to see a 3-foot-tall woman standing at the end of the bed. I remember reaching for you and you were gone. It was the middle of the night and I have no idea what time it was. What did she look like? Can you draw her? I asked. I'll try, but first just let me finish. This woman wore a dark hooded robe of some kind tied at the waist with a cord. The hood covered most of her head. Her eyes were big. Terry, they were almost as big as that picture on the book cover. I mean, the one that scared you at the mall. She was between the foot of our bed and the window, so it was hard to see her clearly in silhouette. But I saw her clear enough. I said, go on. What else can you remember? I wasn't scared. I wasn't anything. She just looked at me and I heard her voice inside my head. Her lips never moved. She told me everything is okay, go back to sleep. Just those 7 words. I screamed. She told me everything is okay, go back to sleep. That's what I did. The next morning, I woke up and wondered if maybe it had been a dream. But it was so real. We were both lost in thought for a moment. She looked to me for validation. Terry, I believe this really happened. As an afterthought she added, oh, and one more thing to add. When I got the laundry together, there was a drop of blood on your pillowcase again this morning. I didn't know it at the time, but I've been programmed. We'd been programmed. So be it. Deep down I knew that I wasn't supposed to talk about them. I knew these things have rules. I either followed the rules or risked being punished. They are not benevolent space brothers. They have an agenda all right, but it's not a cure for cancer or to give us a new source of energy to replace petroleum. Their agenda is purely pragmatic. They are 100% goal-driven. I always wondered, if they share their technology with us, what thou give in return? What's the quid pro quo? I decided to put my bike up for sale the following week. I'd miss riding, but that fear of being in open spaces had returned. At least I was spared weeks of horrific nightmares this time. What happened to me during those lost hours? It would be years before I found out.
Cheryl. A significant event occurred in 1977 when I was a young NCO in the United States Air Force. It's a complex story, and before I revisit it, I'd like to share with you someone else's story that is directly related to mine. Her story bolsters mine. It is true, and I think you'll find it fascinating. It belonged to a client from my legal practice. I'll protect her privacy by calling her Cheryl, and I'll alter the location a bit. But otherwise, this is the truthful telling of Cheryl's bizarre tale and my involvement. I was in the office on a Friday morning and I took an early telephone call. It was just 7:30 a.m. I was in the office early to prepare for a 9 a.m. hearing. Always eager for new business, I answered the phone on the first ring. It was from a newly retired General Motors factory worker named Cheryl. She said an old friend of hers from the car plant had referred me. She said I was recommended because I was an honest lawyer. That made my day. I understood the importance of referrals. I wanted my name to pop up when a client, or a client's friend or relative, found themselves in trouble. It seemed that an awful lot of people had problems of one kind or another. But for me, it's what I referred to as a happy problem. My success was the product of others' misfortune. Much like driving an ambulance. Cheryl had plenty to say. I broke into her rant to say, whoa, slower please, I'm having trouble following you. I was scribbling notes onto a legal pad and trying to find out the nature of her problem. I told her, please madam, save the details for a face-to-face meeting. For now, just tell me. What is your problem? Slowing her speech, she complained about neighbors trespassing on her property at night. She claimed that they shined bright lights into her bedroom window, waking her up at night and scaring her. That was all. A simple trespass onto her property was a legitimate legal issue. I bet there's a whole lot more to this story. There always is. I reject cases if there are no legal issues, as any ethical lawyer should. Lots of people seek legal help for family problems, troublesome neighbors, and hurt feelings. There are TV judges and psychologists to address those issues. We discussed my fee structure. She asked to schedule an appointment, preferably in the afternoon, but soon. Fortunately, I had a slot open the following Monday. I was free for the entire day after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She agreed to be at my office at 3 o'clock Monday afternoon. I asked her to write out a brief narrative of the events, including a list of the names and addresses of everyone involved. I was intrigued by the urgency in her voice. Neighbor-to-neighbor feuds can sometimes end with people being hurt or worse. It's the reason so many police officers are wounded or killed when responding to domestic disturbance calls. Before hanging up, I felt it wise to offer some advice. I said, Cheryl, I don't know what may have happened to make this matter urgent today. But remember, you can always call 911 if you feel threatened and the police will respond. She said simply, okay, and I ended the call. Cheryl arrived 15 minutes early and sat in the waiting room. She looked things over and flipped through a movie magazine, all the while careful not to loosen the grip she held on her purse. It was on her lap and held firmly in place with one hand juggling the magazine with the other. She was very disappointed to learn we were a non-smoking building. Having studied psychology, I was keen on watching people for nonverbal cues. I studied her posture and appearance. Body language speaks volumes, as does choice of attire. I sized up Cheryl as eccentric. Her eccentricity would prove to be off the chart. She was well groomed but wore a hand-knitted sweater that was outdated and too small for her large frame. She wore a garish blouse with a checkered pattern of alternating browns and orange. The pattern on her pantsuit was brown and tan, with horizontal stripes. She completed the outfit with a sturdy pair of white nursing-style shoes. Her hair had been curled into a style reminiscent of what my sisters wore in the late 60s. This should be interesting, I thought to myself. That would turn out to be an understatement. Just not in a way I could have ever guessed. Thank God it was a slow day. With luck, I could be out of the office by 4 o'clock and free to enjoy an abbreviated Monday. There would be plenty of long days to balance the scale. I went down the short stairwell and introduced myself. She shook my hand in a masculine manner with eye contact but no smile. She followed as we headed to my office. I asked, "Can I get you a cup of coffee?" "No thank you, it's too late in the day," she said. I was grateful. She did not look like someone who needed caffeine. Once inside my office, I shut the office door as always. I noticed her eyes darting as she looked over the office. Before being seated, she put on a pair of drugstore glasses and inspected my law degree and license to practice. I did my best to engage her in small talk without much success. I noticed she kept a death grip on that purse. It was planted square on her lap, and not once did she set it on the floor. I took that to mean she's cautious. With the small talk going nowhere, I decided to get down to business. I asked, "Okay Cheryl, did you bring a brief narrative with names and addresses of your problem neighbors?" "No, I can tell you everything you need to know," Cheryl said. I was annoyed. I asked her to please tell me the neighbor's name, so I could be certain there was no conflict of interest. There wasn't. Probing, I asked her to tell me all about her neighbors, the trespass, and lights shined in her window. "Can you tell me about that?" I asked. Ignoring my question, she made eye contact and in a serious tone and asked, "Can I trust you, Mr. Lovelace? I need someone to talk to. I need someone who won't think I'm crazy and listen to me." Her question struck me as somewhat odd. I tried to size up her mental status. She seemed fully functional but impaired in some way. I'm not a psychologist. It didn't take a psychologist to tell that she had problems. Alarm bells rang in my head. I was cautious about dealing with the mentally ill. I preferred to represent them through a guardian if one had been appointed by the court. I also glanced at my watch. I couldn't listen to a half hour of nonsense. But I pressed on. "Yes, you can trust me. Everything you tell me is held in strict confidence," I said. I assured her that I would not lie to her. I promised to keep her informed of everything happening with her case. There would be no surprises. I would take no action in her case without her prior approval. She nodded and said she understood. She was a bit more relaxed. I gave her a written fee agreement to read. She went through it line by line, making certain she understood. She would need to pay some money up front if she decided I could help her with whatever was going on with the neighbors. In a casual voice I asked her, Cheryl, do you handle all your own financial affairs? Offended by my question she spat back, I handle all of my own money if that's what you mean. I ignored it and continued. With the formalities finished, I asked her again, now Cheryl, please tell me about your problem, and I'll see what I can do to help. She said, okay, but you're not going to charge me a lot of money, are you? I said, Cheryl, if after we talk today, I don't think you have a legal matter that I can help you with, or if you can't afford the fee, there will be no charge for today's visit. If your neighbors are causing you a problem, sometimes a stern letter from a lawyer can end the matter. That would be a very affordable option. That seemed to satisfy her. She began sheepishly. She said, well, I haven't been exactly honest with you, it's not my neighbors, Mr. Lovelace. I believe it is aliens. I'm being visited by them. Do you believe in aliens? I nearly choked on my bottled water. Surely, I misunderstood. Did that come out of her mouth? I was rattled by her question. It took me a moment to regain my composure. I'm sorry, I want to be clear. Cheryl, you're talking about an immigration issue here? Are these people that trespass and shine lights through your window at night, are they from another country and here to work in the United States illegally? She looked confused for a moment and said firmly, no. I am talking about men who come here from outer space in a flying saucer. Sometimes in a great big ball-looking thing too. They shine white, orange and green lights in my bedroom window. Sometimes red lights too. Do you believe in visitors from outer space? My thoughts flashed back to a winter morning at about 3 o'clock in 1966. I shook off the memory and continued. I tried very hard to not appear ruffled by her statements. Calmly, I said, Cheryl, my beliefs aren't relevant, but yes, I believe there's life in this great big universe. Now go on, please. I'm listening to you. I'm not judging you in any way. Tell me the truth and I'll see if I can help you. She dropped her voice to just above a whisper. They come in a flying saucer with lights and they come onto my property. They shine bright lights in my bedroom window at night and they scare me. Now, I believe they've been inside my house. She looked very frightened. What makes you think that they've been in your home? I asked. She was visibly trembling. It was apparent that something had scared this woman out of her wits. Well, what scared me the most was the little person. I saw it just out of the corner of my eye. I saw it dart past my bedroom door and it scared me. Oh, they make my skin crawl. I said, I understand. Please go on. I knew this wasn't a legal problem. Still, I really wanted to do something to help this woman if possible. Because I know what it's like to see something, to be very afraid and have no one believe you. But I'm not a mental health professional. This was dangerous territory. They scare me. The police won't come anymore, and they think I'm crazy, she said. I think she was a little embarrassed. She searched my face for any sign of empathy or understanding. Cheryl, I don't think you have a legitimate legal issue here. I don't know what I can do to help you if the problem doesn't originate with your next-door neighbors. So, you can't help me either? She said. She was crestfallen. I said, I'm so sorry. It was the best I could offer her. She pulled her chair back to leave. I remained seated. Cheryl, there's no charge for our visit today, but I do have an idea. Just sit down and listen for a moment. Do you have a nice camera? She sat back down and looked puzzled but eager to hear what I had to say. She shook her head. She asked, no. Why do you ask? I explained, then go to a pawn shop or somewhere and buy yourself a decent 35mm camera, one with a telephoto lens if possible, and a tripod. You don't need to spend a lot of money. Do you have a friend or a relative that knows about cameras? She thought for a minute and said, yes, I have a niece who'd help me, I bet. She loves her Aunt Cheryl. She knows all about photography. She was smiling now for the first time. I could see she had wheels turning. Set your camera on the tripod. Aim it out the window that faces the spot where the spaceship usually lands. Make sure you have it focused in the area where the flying saucer lands. The next time the aliens come back, you get as many pictures of them as you can. Be sure and buy film made to work in poorly lighted conditions. Ask the store clerk for help choosing film. Usually, someone can give you advice. Maybe your niece will help you. Come back and see me when you get them on film. Bring me the pictures and we can consider our next step. Does that sound fair? Oh yes, thank you. What's our next step then? She asked. I didn't answer her because I didn't have the slightest idea what the next step might be. But it was all I could think of. It's questionable ethics maybe, but I thought maybe this would put the issue to bed for her. I at least offered her an active plan to battle her problem. It couldn't hurt. Oh, what a marvelous idea, Cheryl said. She was beaming. She was thrilled with the idea. I also think she was just happy that someone listened to her and offered a solution of sorts. She thanked me repeatedly and I escorted her to the front door. Before she could drive away, I asked her, "Cheryl, you should talk to your doctor too. Will you do that for me please?" She didn't reply. She hopped into her truck, fired up a cigarette, and was gone. I thought, that's the last I'll ever see of Cheryl. I felt like I did the right thing. I certainly did her no harm. I went back to work now half an hour behind. I scolded myself for playing therapist instead of practicing law. A month later my secretary buzzed me. "There's a Cheryl on line 1. She said she talked to you a couple weeks ago and she has some big news." Rolling my eyes, I said aloud, "Oh my God, here we go." I picked up the phone. "This is Mr. Lovelace." A very agitated Cheryl was on the line. Just like last time, she spoke so fast I couldn't make out what she was saying. I asked her to please slow down. As usual she began in a rant. "This is Cheryl Foster from Benton. I did it, Mr. Lovelace. I finally got some real pictures of the aliens. Oh, I'm so excited. I got a picture of their spaceship. I even got pictures of them in me backyard, walking down the train tracks behind the house, and oh, I want to nail these little bastards." I started to say something, but she cut me off in mid-sentence. At least she dialed down her speed so I could understand her. "I took your advice, Mr. Lovelace. My niece liked the idea too. She helped me set it all up. Then I waited. I'll be damned. 2 nights ago they came back. I got pictures of the little sons of bitches and their spaceship too. Do you want to see the pictures?" I was unsure what to do. I was curious as hell. What the hell did she see? And I wanted to see what this woman photographed. Her timing was terrible. I had an hour and 30 minutes of time devoted to writing a brief. I could slide her into that slot and finish my brief after dinner. I told her, "Yes, bring the pictures. Come right on over." She exclaimed, "Oh, wonderful, I'm on my way." Before she could hang up, I told her, "Bring in the photographs and the negatives together. Keep them in the drugstore package along with your receipt if possible. Did your camera print the date on the back of each picture?" "Oh yes, they show the time too." "You'll see. My niece set up my camera to do all that. I'm on my way now." I told her goodbye and hung up. I asked my law clerk to stick around for just a bit. While waiting, I wondered, what the hell did this woman photograph? Maybe we could sell them to a tabloid paper? Can I even do that ethically? If she would agree to it, there'd be no harm. I would insist that her niece be a party to the whole affair. I didn't want to be accused of taking advantage of this fragile and vulnerable woman. What would my colleagues think? Could I be exploiting her? I was getting way ahead of myself. This was time I could use productively. But I also thought, who knows, this could be profitable and helpful for both of us. Cheryl must have made the drive doing 90 miles per hour. 15 minutes later she arrived. I was downstairs waiting for her. She snuffed out her cigarette on my wooden front porch and came inside heading straight forth stairs. I followed behind her. I'd given this some forethought. When we reached the second floor landing, I said, "Let's go into my conference room with the large table instead of the smaller desktop in my office. The table is much bigger, and we can lay everything out in front of us." She hesitated. "Is it safe?" Her comment would only make sense if spoken by one abductee to another. To put her at ease I said, "Give me just a minute to shut the drapes and look things over. Just to be sure. Please wait right here for me." She cautioned, "Make sure you check the closet." After a minute or two, I came back out. In a serious tone of voice, I assured her, "Everything is secure. Come in and I'll shut the door." She came in and took a chair, but only after she had visually inspected the entire conference room. I sat next to her. Her eyes swept the room for a second time before she felt relaxed enough to speak. "Oh, Mr. Lovelace, wait till you see these." She released the death grip she had on her white plastic purse. Clicking open the clasp, she carefully removed the drugstore photo packet. The odor of tobacco smoke rose around us. She handled the package like ITWAS dynamite and handed them to me. All the while she was smiling, but I noticed a tremor in her hands that I didn't see many weeks back. Taking out the photographs, I quickly flipped through all 24 color photographs. I methodically laid them on the table in the order of the negatives. I numbered each one with pencil on back and kept them in the same order as the negatives. I listed them on my legal pad, plus the date and time. I noticed her photographs were taken over a 30-hour period. Now, I could study them. While I was not surprised, I admit I was disappointed. Like a kid getting socks for Christmas disappointment. Cheryl had managed to photograph her neighbors. They were in a variety of outside activities. She captured them hanging up laundry, gardening, and performing an assortment of ordinary outside activities in their own backyards. There were several shots of high school kids. They were just strolling along the railroad tracks with their backpacks at the far end of her property. A few of the night shots were too blurry to make out much. I saw no one trespass onto her land, but there was one intriguing photograph that caught my eye. It was the first one she took. I gave it a second, careful inspection. It was taken in the dark, but the quality was nearly good. It was an object on the tracks that appeared to be in motion. I asked, "Did your niece help you find the right kind of film?" "Oh yes, she's a very sharp girl. She knows all about cameras. She thought it was a good idea to get pictures too." The shot I found intriguing was focused squarely on the railroad tracks toward the back of her property. It was dark except for a blurred semicircular object. There was a streak of gray light along the side and two smaller green and yellow lights in the center facing the house. It sat squarely on the railroad tracks. Then I saw one tiny red dot in the pitch black background. It washed above the image and to the right. It looked out of place. Around the crescent-shaped object on the tracks there appeared to be a fog or a mist. It was a solid object in motion, but it was impossible to discern which direction it was traveling. "Tell me about this one," I asked. Cheryl said it was the only one she could get of their spacecraft. I said, "Tell me how it came to your attention." "It landed on the tracks about 4:30 yesterday morning." "Oh, they still scare me so bad. Their lights woke me up again and I followed all the instructions my niece gave me. I took the picture. Why didn't you take more?" That was all the pictures. It never crossed my mind. Besides, all I wanted to do was go back to sleep. I got the best ones the next day. Apathy. I completely understood. I arranged all 24 photographs on the table side by side in sequence. One shot was a photograph of boys walking along the railroad tracks. It was interesting because comparing it to image number 1 of the spaceship, it was the identical location taken in daylight. I compared the two side by side. I was amazed. I discovered a tiny red dot above the blur of color in the nighttime shot. It matched exactly to the top of a communication tower visible in the distance and just to the right in the daytime photographs. The tower's light was turned off during daylight hours. Using my desk lamp, I put the two negatives together, one on top of the other, and studied them closely. They lined up perfectly. The red dot was smack on top of the tower and gave me a point of reference. I showed the two photographs to Cheryl and pointed out the communication tower as a point of reference. But she was not overly impressed. She felt the best photograph was the schoolboys walking on the tracks. She insisted that if you look closely, you'd see they were really aliens. I did look closely, very closely. I didn't see anything that looked like an alien. I could sense she was becoming frustrated with me. Ethically, I wouldn't lie to her and play along with boys walking on the railroad tracks. But I had learned years earlier not to argue with mental illness. When I complimented her and praised her for doing such a terrific job, her attitude turned on a dime. She was smiling again. Eagerly she said, "So, what's our next move?" "Yes," I said aloud. "What is our next move?" The room was silent for a long while. I suggested, "Why don't you let me keep copies of about 3 of your best ones? I'll pay you for the prints and there's no charge for my time today. I'd like to keep the negatives too, just this one strip. You can have them back whenever you like. With your permission, I'll show them to some folks who may know what these things are. I promise, I'll keep you informed and respect your privacy." I buzzed my law clerk and asked him run to the drugstore on the corner and make prints of these 3 pictures from the negative. I handed him a 20. He glanced at Cheryl and his eyes widened. He knew the matter was emergent. He was off at a trot. Cheryl and I chatted in my office. Her mental impairment was no more apparent and making me uncomfortable. I suggested she move outside to the front porch. She could have a cigarette while I typed a receipt for her and an agreement. To be honest, I felt uncomfortable being alone with her. I made sure the door was open and my secretary was within earshot until Cheryl made it to the front porch. The contract acknowledged that the prints and negatives would remain her property. I would only keep the 3 prints and the corresponding negatives in my possession until I was done with them, or until she requested them back. She gave me her express permission to show them to people who might be able to identify the images and offer suggestions. I promised to not publish them without her prior written permission. I said, "Keep your other prints and negatives someplace safe. I'll see what I can come up with. Don't worry, this will be our secret. I promise to call you when I have any news." Just then my law clerk returned, thank God. Cheryl was beginning to grow agitated again. I returned her pictures and the negatives, less 1 strip, in the same envelope. I also gave her a copy of the agreement she signed. I was happy to see that she read it. She said she had no questions. "Cheryl, try to get some more pictures." "Yes, I will." She lit another cigarette, hopped in the cab of her truck, and drove off. I had a nagging suspicion that my phone would ring 20 times a day with alien sightings over Bennington. Cheryl had the potential to become a pest and a genuine problem. I was beginning to think this had been a huge mistake. Fortunately, I was wrong. She did not turn into a pest. In fact, I never took another call from her. As it turned out, I'd never see the woman again. Over the next few weeks, I showed the dark picture to a few friends. They all just shrugged their shoulders. I showed acquaintances from all walks of life and from a variety of backgrounds. It was just an interesting photograph, somewhat out of focus. I never let on that the object in the photograph might be alien in origin. I just presented it in an offhand way and asked what they thought was captured in the picture. A few people were sure it was a train. A few were dismissive immediately and made comments ranging from, "That's an out-of-focus Christmas tree," to sillier opinions not worth mentioning. But a faculty member from Michigan State University looked at the photograph for me and showed a keen interest. "Where do you get this?" he asked. I explained, "The photograph belongs to a client. It just caught my attention because it looks like something sitting on the railroad tracks." I asked him to compare the daylight and nighttime photographs side by side. Like me, he recognized the tower immediately as a point of reference. After 5 full minutes, he concluded, "That is most likely a train. But the semicircular shape of the object and the lights make me think not. Also, I don't know what could be causing the smoke. There are no steam locomotives operating anymore, at least not around here." He was about to hand the picture back when he asked, "Let me have another look, may I?" I was grateful for his interest. "Absolutely, I'm curious and your opinion is appreciated." He explained, "In the photograph, the lights are pointed in the direction of the photographer and not nearly bright enough to be the headlamp. The train's headlamp should be pointed ahead of the train, illuminating the track ahead. But nothing on the track in front or back of this thing is lit up." I was quick with a compliment, "Good observation, Professor, good eye." It was a detail that no one, including myself, had picked up on. As far as I was concerned, that eliminated the possibility that the object was a train. Before he left, he suggested, "Call my buddy Manuel. He just retired from the railroad after something like 40 years. Tell him Curtis gave you his number. I bet he can tell you right off the bat if that's a train or not." He pulled out his wallet and sorted through a few business cards and found the phone number for me. I jotted it down and thanked him. Feeling guilty, I admitted that I was allowing my experiences and bias to turn this into an obsession. I reminded myself that I was self-employed. Every hour I wasted chasing Cheryl's spaceship was an hour I could use to generate income or time I could spend with my kids. Whatever Manuel might have to say about Cheryl's photograph, this would be my final effort. I called Manuel that afternoon. He answered my call on the 5th ring. "Hello, this is Manny." I said, "Manuel, you don't know me. I'm a friend of Professor Curtis from the university. He gave me your number and said you could maybe help me out. I have a question about a photograph of a train. Tells me you're the guy that can identify the train for us. Could you help me out and just look at it for me? Your professional opinion would be appreciated." He was friendly, even chipper. "Sure, I love old trains. I'd be happy to help you out, and please, call me Manny." I didn't take the time to explain that it wasn't a picture of an old locomotive. We chatted for a few minutes. Manny lived about a half-hour drive from my office. Rather than driving to my office and risking entanglement in downtown traffic, he suggested we meet at a local restaurant located about halfway to downtown. He didn't want to risk being caught in the notorious downtown rush hour. I didn't blame him. We agreed to meet at 2 o'clock on Wednesday off the following week. I called Cheryl to let her know about the meeting. I wanted her talk now I had an expert to look at her prints. But no one answered, and I had no way to leave her a message, as her mailbox was full. I didn't give it much thought at the time. I had her permission anyway, but I wanted her to be in the loop. I had promised that I'd keep her informed. I would send her a letter. I arrived at 2 o'clock sharp. The lunch crowd had thinned out by then. Manny was easy to spot. He's a very large man who wore a distinctive railroad cap. He was already comfortably planted in a booth with coffee in front of him. He told me he had just ordered lunch. I sat across from him and followed his lead, looking over the menu. We both had a hamburger, and Manny began talking about his favorite topic: trains. Before our lunch arrived, Manny gave me a brief rundown of his experience with the railroad. He was certainly qualified to express an expert opinion. This is a man who loved the railroad. Our lunch arrived just as I pulled out the 2 photographs and the negatives. Manny was eager to look them over. But he was visibly disappointed I didn't have a photograph of an old locomotive. But he was still interested. His evaluation took just a couple minutes. "First, this is not a modern diesel engine or any other kind. This isn't a train," Manny said with confidence. "If it's not a train, What else could be on the tracks, Manny? I asked. He said, this is nothing I'm familiar with. If it runs on rails in the United States or Canada, I could identify it even with the poor lighting condition. I think, is this thing moving? I asked, so, you think it's in motion, Manny? Quote, yeah, the way this gray part is blurred it looks like something in motion. The cloud of steam is stationary. It looks like it's moving to me. I see what you mean, Manny. So, is it moving to the left or to the right in the photograph? Manny took a break to stare at the photo for a few more seconds and finish his coffee in a final gulp. Neither. I don't know many things that travel up and down other than helicopters. Manny let out a nervous chuckle. But he looked disturbed. I need to know where the shot was taken, Mr. Lovelace. This is a danger to people and property. If this is happening as frequently as she says, I need to let a yard agent know. Can I get an address and a copy of your print? Sorry, these belong to my client. I can't lend you these or disclose the location either without her permission. She took these in her backyard, Manny. The tracks are still in use. Whatever this thing is, it shows up about once a month between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning and scares the hell out of her. That piqued Manny's interest. He asked, has your client ever seen this thing move? I don't know. I never thought to ask, Manny, I said, feeling a little dumb for not asking the obvious. Manny asked, if your client thinks this is a train, did she call the railroad and complain? Manny, my client has some limitations. She thinks somehow her neighbors are in control of the whole thing. Now I see. Manny got my point. I said, thanks, Manny. I can see it could be a hazard to railroad traffic. Yeah, if it sits on the tracks, she should notify the railroad, Manny added. Manny took off his cap and scratched his bald head. He mumbled, what could travel straight up and down, Mr. Lovelace? I said, I don't know. Do you have any ideas that you'd care to share with me, Manny? Manny knew more than he was telling me. My intuition told me Manny has had an experience or two of his own. He lowered his voice, you'll think this is crazy, but when I used to drive freight, I was crossing the New Mexico desert in 1959. About midnight, straight ahead of me, I saw what I thought was a car sitting on the track a mile ahead. I hit my whistle hard and flashed my lights. So, what happened? I asked. It shined a very bright spotlight back at me for a second or maybe two. Then it bolted straight into the air like a bullet. It was faster than any damn helicopter. It was something out of this world, I'll tell you that. Manny, you can trust me. I don't doubt one word of it, I said. I believed him. Manny knew I believed him. I put Cheryl's photographs and negatives back in the envelope and put them in my breast pocket. I picked up the tab for lunch and promised Manny I'd get back to him as soon as I had my client's permission to disclose the location. He understood the privacy issue. We walked out together toward our respective cars. I shook his hand again. He urged me to try to get in touch with my client, so the matter could be investigated. I headed back to the office. I called Cheryl to let her know what I discovered, which wasn't much. But it was the end for me. I was about to hang up when a young woman answered the phone. In a businesslike tone, a woman answered, "Hello. Foster residence. Who's calling, please?" I said, "My name is Terry Lovelace." "Is Cheryl available?" "No, I'm sorry. Can I ask what this is about?" She said. I introduced myself and she told me she was Cheryl's niece Cindy. She recognized my name from conversations with her aunt and a business card on the refrigerator. Cindy explained that her Aunt Cheryl's health had deteriorated swiftly and considerably. Cindy said, "My aunt lost her mind, the poor thing. She always treated me like a daughter. I am so sorry." "Your aunt was a very kind lady, and I agree. A bit of a lost soul. She spoke very highly of you," I said. "Thank you, Mr. Lovelace," she said. Cheryl's family was there to put her things in order. An auction was scheduled for the following weekend. Cheryl had been moved to an assisted living facility. Cindy told me she was her aunt's personal representative and had power of attorney. "I'm so sorry to hear all this," I told her. "If you're calling about a bill, you'll need to get in line," she said. I explained, "No, I just have a couple photographs that belong to her." "You're the lawyer that suggested she should set up a camera?" she asked. I admitted, "Yes, that was my idea, Cindy. I thought it might help on, didn't think it could cause any harm." "How much did you charge her for that?" She was blunt. Obviously, she was protective of her aunt. I explained that I didn't charge her. I added, "Cindy, I asked your Aunt Cheryl to see her doctor." "That's all right then, Mr. Lovelace." "Anything else?" she asked. I asked Cindy. I have her photographs and negatives she left with me. "Would you like me to mail them to your attention?" "No, whatever photographs you have you can just keep. Maybe the next time I make it downtown I'll stop by and pick them up." Aunt Cheryl had the habit of holding on to things, lots of things. We have enough to deal with already. I told her I understood and said, I'll keep the photographs just in case you decide to swing by and pick them up. We both knew she never would. I hung up and directed my energies to cases that needed my attention. Cases that paid the bills. The photographs were secured in my locked desk drawer. They could sit there until Cindy showed up or until someone who knew more about trains than Manny came along. Meanwhile, they served as a good reminder just how precious time was. I rolled up my sleeves and dove back into my work. A few months later I arrived at work early, about 7 a.m. I could hear the siren of my alarm system wailing before I'm even out of my car. Unfortunately, the alarm system I bought was a cheap one. It didn't automatically dial the police when triggered. It just let out an ear-piercing siren designed to draw attention. My building was surrounded by offices that were vacant after 6 p.m. so a break-in wouldn't draw attention if it happened in the middle of the night. The front door to the office was wide open. It looked like it was opened with a key, so I wouldn't need to replace a doorframe. Just a few new locks. I switched off the alarm and dialed 911. The older downtown section near the courthouse was an area in decline. Over the years, crime had become a worsening problem. It was safe during daylight hours. But at night, the downtown was a different world. My secretary joined me on the porch, and we waited for the police to arrive. It was after 10 a.m. before police allowed us back into the building. I began assembling an inventory of what was missing. My secretary and law clerk began working the phones to cancel my appointments and reschedule court matters set for that morning. Of course, the first thing I checked was the office safe. Either they couldn't open it or just didn't bother. Luckily, no important documents were missing. They looted every desk drawer looking for anything of value. Evidently, there wasn't a lot of value in hot office supplies. They had rummaged around and found a couple bucks and a few parking meter tokens. Aside from a $20 bill I always kept in my drawer, nothing appeared to be missing from my desk at least. I even checked for the envelope with Cheryl's photographs. They were right where I placed them. An antique set of Justice scales worth about $150 were missing. None of the computers were missing. That was our good fortune. Nothing of real value was lost. Probably using a crowbar or similar tool, they pried open a few desks, mine included. I always kept it locked. There was no damage to the front door frame. All in all, we fared better than some. An officer on the scene told me, break-ins are common. It's a little unusual to break into a law office, but it happens. They look for anything they can sell for drugs. Laptops and cameras are hot items. Of course, they break into desks to look for cash or handguns. I'd suggest an upgrade to your alarm system and replace your locks. Good advice, thanks. We cleaned up and I filed an insurance claim. We just moved on. A year or so later I had a divorce client who was very concerned about losing his collection of toy trains. It was an ugly divorce as most are. His soon-to-be ex-wife wanted half the value of his toy train collection. Of all the things acquired during the marriage, including a daughter, his biggest concern was his toy train collection. He asked, "She can't take my trains, can she?" I told him the bad news: she can claim 1/2 interest in the toy trains or their value. That doesn't count the trains you owned before you married her. He was quick to correct me. They were model trains, not toys. These are precision-made miniatures that run on electric track. They are made by craftsmen in Germany mostly. He boasted that he recently bought a single locomotive for $400 and congratulated himself for negotiating such a shrewd deal. Every man has his toys, boats, motorcycles, golf clubs, guns, and fishing equipment. Of course, others just drank. I explained a sensitive point: for negotiating your divorce settlement, the less value they have the better. So, when I refer to them as toy trains in your paperwork, don't be offended. Giving up half of less is better than half of more. He understood. I was forever amazed by the stuff adult men buy and treasure. Grown men should put their spare cash into their 401k, which they had neglected to fund for 20 years. Toy trains were more fun than numbers in a piece of paper. While we were on the topic of trains, Cheryl's photographs came to mind. I asked, "Could you look at a picture of a train and tell me what we're looking at?" He said, "Sure, I'd be happy to." "Let's see what you got." I opened my desk drawer to grab Cheryl's pictures. Reaching into the back of the drawer, my fingers grabbed the envelope. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. I'd not touched them since my lunch with Manny months before the burglary. As soon as I picked up the manila envelope, I knew immediately it was too light. I remembered after the burglary I checked to make sure the envelope was still in my drawer. The envelope was there, but I neglected to open it to check on the pictures in the negative. If Cindy had stopped by to pick them up, No one from my office would have pulled them out of my drawer without my permission. My desk drawer was off limits, and anything that goes out the door required a signed receipt. I'd check with everyone just to be sure. But of course, no one had. I was dumbfounded. They were gone. The photographs and the negatives were all missing from the envelope. Occasionally, things slipped my mind. But handling a client's property was on a different level than misplacing my keys. Client's property was treated like gold. It's called a fiduciary duty. I wondered what possible value could they have to anyone? Shutting my desk drawer, I politely said, "Thanks anyway. They're probably in my safe downstairs." We moved along, and I finished his business. As soon as we were done, I ran downstairs and opened my safe. They were not there. Of course, they were not there. I knew where I kept them. They were locked in my desk drawer. I had the only key on my keyring with a duplicate set safely at home. I distinctly recalled bringing them back after meeting with Manny and putting them away. But now they were gone. The entire incident was unnerving. But I'm sure there was a simple explanation.